We're going to do a quick one today because I have some feelings. Because I love you guys very much, we're doing the lazy recording interface where I just put two pillows on either side of my desk and it probably doesn't actually do anything. I'm so glad you could join us today in talking about Behind the Frame, the finest scenery, but I'd like to go over some things before we begin. This video will try to be semi-spoiler free by not showing too many puzzle solutions or major story beats, but as we'll be talking about the themes of the game, it's not unlikely to suggest that you may connect the dots regardless. So I'd highly recommend playing the game yourself before watching this if you want a blind experience. Behind the Frame is a first-person, story-focused puzzle game that's $10 on PC through a variety of storefronts, and is even on iOS and Android for a fraction of the price, and it only takes an hour to play. If you got cash and a few minutes to burn, it's honestly worth a look for one of the sweetest and most heartfelt games you'll play this year. The early 2020s so far have been a bit of a creative block for me. There's my YouTube channel where I try to plate spin multiple niches at once out of worry for keeping my audience engaged. There's my weekly Twitch stream. There's my work over in the vSynth community. I tried painting at one point, that was an experience. And I decided to add on to that pile this year by trying music production, which so far has involved installing FL Studio back in August and then promising myself that I'd eventually look up some Skillshare courses, which I still haven't just yet. In other words, I attach a lot of my identity and thus mental health to being able to find what I enjoy creating the most, and doing it often in the hopes of building a following and potentially a safe career. At the ripe age of 22, I don't know what the future holds, nor what I plan on doing with the rest of my life. My qualifications aren't the greatest, and I'm in sort of a dead-end job, so oftentimes when I do work on something for you all, it's within the context that I'm playing catch-up the entire time, while thinking everyone else my age has made a life for themselves already, be it by moving on to college and university, or just reaching a successful output of sorts. Which is what makes Behind the Frame, the finest scenery such an interesting game for me, because it doesn't contain or challenge any of these thoughts or struggles I engage with on a day-to-day basis. Instead, Behind the Frame draws you away from those struggles for just a moment, and is purely focused on the creative process in of itself and what it means to our characters when approached in a vacuum, which becomes oddly refreshing for someone like myself. The game tells the story of a graphic designer in her apartment trying to finish her latest painting and submit to a gallery. The player guides her through her daily routine while occasionally solving puzzles and speculating about her elderly neighbour across the way. Everything's done through a straightforward point-and-click scheme, scribbling in a notebook, tapping in an application form, and while the story is most definitely at the centre stage in this game, interactivity and feedback is crammed into each story beat to really make you feel engaged, like you have a hand in the progression, rather than being a spectator watching the events unfold from afar. Even the soundtrack in the game is framed as a compilation of some of the protagonist's favourite songs that they're playing to accompany their painting. It's literally work music, and I've been listening to it while working on this script. It just adds a more diegetic feel to the game that makes the tiny apartment feel all the more alive and fleshing out our main character's lifestyle and interests. Side note, the soundtrack? Never before have I, in the middle of the end credits to a game, immediately head back over to the Steam store to see if I could buy the entire album. Yes, you're gonna hear it in my videos from now on. But that's the crux of how Behind the Frame gives itself so much charm. Its characterization through environmental design. The panoramic environments you're taken through are gorgeous alone, but they're also crammed with detail to add little smatterings of character development. For example, each morning you're tasked with the same things: putting on some background music, making toast and eggs, prepping some coffee, and typing out your resume for the millionth time because it got corrupted again. I especially love how paint is written on the to-do list with larger text and surrounded by arrows. It really hits home that it's something the protagonist procrastinates on frequently. After spending almost 2 years speaking with a counsellor for my anxiety, I've begun suspecting that I may be neurodivergent in some sense, and I relate heavily to this framing that every other part of the daily routine is a puzzle piece that exists to keep our protagonist healthy and motivated to work away at this one passion project. I should especially know after spending half of this year remembering to have breakfast so I could spend 4 hours a day working on a screaming anime robot, but you know, passion's a weird thing. But where it gets interesting for me is this light environmental characterization is to an extent where it ends with regards to our protagonist's personal turmoil about being an artist. She's trying to complete her piece in the hopes it gets accepted to the gallery, but Behind the Frame never touches on subjects like her financial or career prospects. Her apartment is rather small, her breakfast is the same every day, and she occasionally forgets to do things like tear the date off the calendar. But while Behind the Frame is about an independent artist, it isn't isn't a story about success, purpose, or mental well-being. Instead, it's a story about passion, love, and the relationships we make. It's a purely emotional journey about creating for the sake of it. If anything, the game is much more fascinated with telling a story of how art preserves and immortalizes the everyday, and why we're so attached to that prospect. It's with each day you study a painting, and with every painting there's a story of how it came to be. What would seem in the moment as mundane happenstance becomes a love story for the ages when elevated to the canvas. And as we learn more about the cast of the game, one thing is apparent. They're happy to spend hours painting purely because they've lived through so many cherished moments that they never want to forget. Behind the Frame feels like it came at a very contemplative time for me, because while it's short and its puzzles are simplistic, it tells an engaging, bittersweet tale that confronts the emotional outlook one can have as a creator through its sheer optimism and patience, while still respecting its role as a video game by giving players a hand in the narrative unfolding for that personal edge. I'm overjoyed that games like this are allowed to exist, because you just can't beat that one title you find where you're willing to brush aside the fact that it's a product in a marketplace and instead embrace its own merits and how they impact you. I've always been scared of the future ever since my first exam period at school, and most of how I spend my spare time is in the hopes that I can find a purpose in life and get back on track. Adulthood responsibilities are terrifying. I never know if I'm doing things right, and I'm always second guessing how I want to spend each day. But Behind the Frame, while acknowledging this urgency, calmly asks you to see happiness in the little and ephemeral things, and to break down why you as an individual chose to commit to your passions in the first place. I think what I'm trying to say is, this game is what I needed right now, because it didn't just take my current anxiety and tell me everything will be alright regardless, but it instead asked me to think about something different for a change. And I want to give you my thanks for bearing with me.